Hi, folks. I'm glad you're all here. You know, it looked like the conference wrapped up about 2 hours ago, so I'm figuring mostly you're the guys who have the late flights and you need somewhere to stay out of the rain, but I'm happy to have you here. I am here to talk a little bit about data science, to a certain extent, as a contrarian, undoing a lot of what I've been hearing for the last 3 days. But let me explain a little bit about what's going on. Okay, I'm talking about data science for the 99%, and I want to start with a little picture here. You may be familiar with the New Yorker. This is a map of the world as seen from 9th Avenue in Manhattan. We can zoom in on that a little bit. I used to live in Manhattan. I went to grad school there. But you know, I'm originally from Los Angeles, which is over there, and now I live in Utah, which is right here. And one of the things I noticed, of course, is that when I told people in Manhattan where I was from, they could never keep it straight. It was just like someplace far away over there. And it lets you know that people's little mental maps of how things work often don't line up with reality very well. And what does this have to do with data science? Well, it's pretty easy. When you think of the field of data science, you tend to think about companies like these. This is from Fast Company, their most innovative companies of 2017 in data science. It's Netflix, Spotify, WeWork, Foursquare, a lot of big players. These are familiar. They're also very large companies. And then Forbes has also put together a list. The 15 data science jobs that pay $100,000 or more. It includes, Lyft actually was the highest paying on average in this list. Lyft, Facebook, Amazon, some of which have been represented here, Walmart, eBay, Intuit. All very good jobs, very good companies, and the work is going to be very useful and obviously it's going to be well compensated. But we do run a risk in the field, and it makes me think about the Hall of Mirrors. You get to see a lot of shiny things, but it's kind of all the same thing again and again and again, and you run the risk of forgetting that there's a world outside of there. So I'm here to sort of like, you know, bring the map up to date just a little bit from what we have. Let me start with a little, here's my mathematical statement. There exists the 99%. That's the turned E, the existential quantifier. Here's the deal. Now, this is from the census. The data's a few years old, but in terms of number of businesses in the US, in 2014, there were nearly 6 million. And I founded mine about 2 years ago, so that should be 459 by now. But that's about 6 million businesses in the US. Interestingly, some of them are really big. So Walmart has over 2 million employees. IBM has 378,000. Amazon, 341, and Apple, looking small on this list, still has over 100,000 employees. And when we think about data science, these are often the kinds of employers that we think about because they're the ones that are actually recruiting data science teams. They'll have a chief data officer. People will do internships with these organizations. On the other hand, most of the companies in the United States are small or medium. We go by a pretty generous definition here in America of 500 employees. Still counts as medium. This is my chart. 99.7% of the companies in the United States are small or medium businesses. 99.7. And in fact, if you want to go micro to just 10 employees, actually fewer than 10, it's still 79% of the companies in the country. So 4 out of 5. And what that means is, well, and just one other thing. Obviously, the big companies employ more people, but even by the number of employees, the small and medium businesses account for almost half of the workers in the country. So there's a really big part of the market there that we don't normally address when we think of data science. Now, I'm not trying to say that big is bad. I work for big companies. And I'm not trying to say, this is my favorite one. This is an actual company. You guys know Super Evil Megacore? If you've ever played Vainglory on your iPhone. This is their corporate headquarters, by the way. One store, and look, when you can fit your entire Super Evil Megacore in one photo, they're not really big. Ironically, they are a small company. They're a small business in San Mateo, California. Small businesses are all around, but you don't necessarily think of them immediately, because if you think about data science, you think of the large tech companies immediately. But small businesses are all around. So for instance, here in Boston, I did a little bit of research. I'm not from Boston. I live in Salt Lake City. But I did a little research. Who here is from Boston? Have you ever seen the bacon truck? Awesome. Okay. We have the bacon truck. The Comedy Studio, which is in the upper floor of the Hong Kong Restaurant and Lounge. The Ministry of Supply, which makes men's clothing. These are all, I looked them up in terms of interesting small businesses in Boston. These are on the list. There's also an awful lot of nonprofit organizations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about nonprofits in addition to small businesses. But mostly what I want to say is that the small and medium businesses and the nonprofits, first off, they're out there. They do exist, even if they don't immediately come to mind. Number two, they actually have data, but they don't have a chief data officer or any analytics staff whatsoever, generally. And consequently, they need you. And so there's an immense opportunity for you to do something useful for these organizations, and I'll give you some specific examples in a couple of minutes. But to help you do this, I want to talk about a couple of things that you might need to think about differently. Now, I said first off, simply acknowledging the existence of the 99.7% of businesses in the US, but you need to learn to do things about you need to learn a little bit about how they operate. So here's a few pointers about small businesses. Number one, you need to know what their goals are. Second, you need to know what their methods are. And third, you need to know about their limits. That one's really important. So let me talk about each of these a little bit more. First off, goals. What you need to know is that they're not from the Silicon Valley startup scene. They're not designed for rapid growth. They're not designed to maximize profitability or to get a big IPO. Rather, they're usually designed to provide a particular service to a particular group. They're designed for sustainability because the person who founded it wants to be in business for the next few years. And they're designed to provide a steady income. And so the ambitions and the purposes tend to be very, very different. And that changes the kind of data you work with, and it changes the kind of analysis that you need to do, and it obviously changes the kind of recommendations you would make to these organizations. Okay, let's talk a little bit about their methods. The first and foremost is this. You work with anybody in small and medium businesses, you get to work with Excel all day long. I actually ran a data science event 2 weeks ago. Half the people there did not have Excel on their computer. That, to me, is mind-boggling. It doesn't seem possible. I'm going to ask, by the way, does anybody here not have Excel on their computer? OK, I realize we're at Open Data Science and stuff, and you say, well, Open Office works. No, it doesn't. It has to be Excel. This is one where you have to put down the cash, and it really seriously has to be Microsoft, the evil empire's version of Excel, because that's what they all use. Now, there is an exception. There's Google Sheets, which is very good in many ways. I know organizations that run entirely off of Chromebooks. But Excel, because Excel has special functionality and integrates with a lot of different things. I know people who have said that their jobs are 99.99% Excel all day long. I have had to give entire talks to data science audiences to say, guys, I'm going to teach you some basics of Excel and how not to completely destroy the data by sorting one column improperly. Because I've done that. It's really easy to do. In fact, let me just mention something here. This is from the Wall Street Journal just a couple of years ago. The key to a good paying job is Microsoft Excel. In fact, Burning Glass Technologies. Are any of you guys here? OK, they signed up. They apparently found a taxi to the airport. That's an organization that's been here. They're the ones who did this research, saying that it turns out that Excel is still a key really, I'd say it's the central data skill in the vast majority of organizations. So if you're not familiar with Excel, I mean, I know you all know it exists. You need to brush up on this one. So I'm not going to tell you how to do neural networks. I'm going to tell you how to work with a spreadsheet. I'm actually not going to tell you. I'm just going to tell you that you need to do it. Okay? You can look it up. Another thing is, you guys are all familiar with Drew Conway's data science Venn diagram. The problem is, when we're in a data science environment, it's very, very, very common for people to focus on two things. First, the coding, and then really the coding in order to do machine learning. And machine learning does extraordinary things. I am a big fan of machine learning algorithms. I think, I'm not trying to put them down here. What I am trying to say is we put a lot of emphasis here on the tippy top of the diagram, and we tend to forget that domain expertise and familiarity with a particular topical area is one of the defining features of data science, and it's something that I don't think I've seen a single presentation on it at this conference. It is still a key element of data science. And so it helps to speak a little bit of business. Now, just quickly, how many of you actually have formed your own business at one point or another? Okay. How many of you actually have business functions at your current job? Okay. So maybe a third or a quarter of you. So you know what I'm talking about. But the business understanding is really important. You know, for instance, I come from an academic background. I can't remember who said this. I have a PhD in social psychology. I'm technically a psychologist. But what I do is I teach statistics to behavioral science students, undergraduates, all day long. And I can tell you an awful lot about how data is used within the social sciences and in academic research. And I also have learned that it's very different from how it's used in the business world. And it's a totally different thing from how it's often taught within data science curriculum. And so there are very significant differences in institutional practice. Really, I'm just saying is that you need to understand the business model that you're going to be working with, and small businesses work on different business models. Okay. A couple of the things about the methods of small businesses, I've mentioned spreadsheets. You've all had experience with spreadsheets one time or another. CRM software, customer relationship management. Any of you ever used a CRM? Okay. How about CMS, a content management system? If you've used WordPress, you're actually using sort of a backdoor CMS. Social media marketing, email marketing, web analytics, and basic SEO practices. In terms of working with small and medium businesses, these are the data things that they're generally most concerned about. And so, for instance, when you ask them where their data is, their first question will be, what data? And then you say, where's your customer list? They go, oh yeah, it's over here. And so that's the data that you would be working with when you work with them. So it helps to be familiar. Now, it's nice that with spreadsheets, there's really only one or two players. But when you get to CRM systems, there's about 1 billion. Salesforce is, I know there are people at this conference from, is anybody here from Salesforce? Who's worked with Salesforce? Okay. It's sort of the biggest and baddest of the CRMs. And I'd say under normal circumstances, it's incredibly expensive. But Salesforce actually offers their versions of their products for free to nonprofit organizations if they apply. And so if you're working with, you know, the nonprofits, you can have an opportunity to interact pretty substantially with Salesforce in terms of pulling the data from it that you then use for your other analyses. Okay, a couple of limits that you need to be aware of in working with these 99.7% of the businesses. A lot of them are severely limited in terms of money. You know, most of the ones that I actually have worked with have operating budgets of under $1 million, sometimes a lot less than that. They're limited in terms of time, and that's closely tied into the limited number of personnel. Most of them have just a handful of people working for them, and they're kind of working to the bone, and they can't take time to learn new skills. And so it doesn't work to tell them, use R and it will be really nice. They just don't have the time. And what that means is if you're working within the company, you might be able to do some of those other things on your own. But if you're working as a consultant, it means you need to speak a different language when you're with them. So specifically, you need to adapt yourself. That's my third of the 5 points. If you're working as a consultant, an advisor, a friend, or even as a founder, you do need to change things a little bit from how you think compared to when you're in your straight-ahead data science mode. Number one is you need to go simple, quick, and cheap. Most of the time, what these people are looking for is not a recommendation engine. They just want to know yes or no to a simple question. Like, for instance, should we try to sell children's clothes? Yes or no. Should we be open 6 days a week instead of 5? Yes or no. And so the questions tend to be very different. These are not nuanced. It's really the between the eyes phenomenon in terms of what you're trying to tell them. And, I'm from an academic world, and we never, ever, ever give a yes or a no to a question. It's always tentative, and more is needed, and the funding will never run out. But we have to give a yes or a no in these situations. All right, a few things that you need to do to make things work. Number one is you need to use common tools. I mentioned spreadsheets are the single most common tool. You do need to be fluent in Excel. I'm not saying you need to write VBA. I'll show you. I got a tiny short list of the things you need to do. It's a very tiny list. But simple things in Excel, and mostly not botch the data when you're doing it. R and Python can be nice with the understanding that they're never, ever going to read it. They're not going to care about the code. They're not going to look at it. It'll be something that you do on your own. And then to use a phrase that I get from one of my professional organizations, the American Psychological Association, use a minimally sufficient analysis. That doesn't mean oversimplify. It means don't overcomplicate. Do the simplest possible thing that will answer the question adequately. In the entrepreneurial world, you talk about your minimum viable product. It's sort of the same idea here, but in terms of analytic strategies. And then finally, always shoot for clarity and applicability. So you want to give simple recommendations like the yes or the no. You want to focus on things that are actually under the organization's control, that they can change. And of course, you need to do things like watch out for causation and correlation, but that's true no matter what you're doing. Now, in terms of the things you actually need to be able to do in analysis, this is a funny one. First, you need to be able to do sums, counts, and percentages. Those are going to account for an enormous amount of the data that you work with. And I assume that you guys all know how to calculate those. Just make sure you know how to calculate them in Excel. Number two is tables and pivot tables. Who here has ever made a pivot table in Excel? Awesome. It's a good thing to do because it turns out, I think of one of my professional friends who says, as far as he's concerned, the reason Excel exists is to make pivot tables. It is the working person's way of exploring data. Now, I have to admit, I don't do it. I use R. I use R all the time. And I can sit there and I can type the code. And I can do bup, 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 bup. But a pivot table is how any of the other people I work with are going to be doing the same kinds of analyses. And a table, I kind of want to put that like in all capital letters. A table means something specific. Do you know how to make tables in Excel? You do the table command, then you can't sort the data improperly. Some people get angry at tables in Excel because they don't work like a regular spreadsheet, but it's much harder to screw them up. So anyhow, learn to use a table. It's really easy. And then third, just knowing how to do subgroup analyses using filters in Excel. You don't need to know VBA. I mean, VBA is nice. You can write macros, but then people think that you're trying to do something screwy to them because it brings up a warning every time they open up the spreadsheet. But just the subgroups and filters and tables, and what you were showing in your tables and in your filters is sums and counts and percentages, and that's it. And so it's a very different way of approaching data. It is absolutely at basic fundamentals, but the reason they're fundamentals is because they work really well in a lot of different places. As a general rule, black boxes are not allowed. There are some very small exceptions to this. So for instance, we've had some talks here by the people from DataKind who will do black box analyses within the nonprofit sector, but that's a very special thing. In general, the reason you don't use a black box is because a machine learning algorithm like deep learning or something is because those are usually designed to let the computer make the decisions for you. It's not really making decisions, it's assigning scores to things or it's making specific recommendations. Those are fine in general when the computer will be handling the end product. It will be putting the recommendation on the bottom of the web page, or it'll be scoring something to be used. But in general, with small and medium businesses, it is still human in the loop analysis and decision making. And so what you're giving them is not conclusions, but you're giving them rules of thumb. You're giving them heuristics that are based on the data. And so the black box is not very good that way because you can't really say what happened between input and output. But with the spreadsheets, it's very easy to point to this cell is throwing off this total, which is affecting this thing over here. I also want to mention a couple of things about data graphics. And I mention this with some ambivalence. My first 3 years in college, I studied design. I took color theory and drawing classes. This stuff is really very near and dear to me. On the other hand, I can tell you that when I see stuff like this, it's really cool. And my first, I'm like, ooh, how'd they do that? And then secondly, what the hell does that even mean? It's social network data. I have no idea what anything on this is. Or here's one that I created myself. A parallel. It's fascinating, but I have to tell you, it's meaningless. And I have to say that again. I have a background in design. I love art. I spent the last 2 nights going to museums here in Boston. Data visualization needs to be really, 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 really simple. And in fact, I'm going to give you my rules for data visualization, especially when dealing with small and medium businesses. First, bar charts. Totally flat 2-dimensional bar charts. Second, maybe a scatter plot. Totally flat 2-dimensional. Third, a line chart. And that's it. That's it. That's going to be 99%. And as I was putting this together, it just made me think about, you got and, but, nor. They'll get you pretty far, and that's it. But the point of this is to keep the graphics as simple as possible. Now, if you need to do something complicated, use small multiples. It's a beautiful way of doing things. At the same time, you can get stuff. This is a Post-it note. You can draw it. It doesn't have to be much. Simple is better. By the way, I will also, I remember several years ago when the IEEE Viz Week conference came to Salt Lake City where I live. And the keynote speaker was actually an experimental psychologist. And she gave her talk talking to really all the computer science people there. She says, okay, number one, users don't think like you do. You want things to be done in one particular way. They're going to try it 49 different ways that you never thought of. Second, you're going to put something in there that's fancy like interactivity, and then they're going to start messing around with it, go, ooh, and forget what they were doing in the first place. And so her point was, don't include something something that could potentially be a distraction. Interactivity and video count as distractions unless it is simply not possible to communicate the point without them. I know that's totally disempowering, and that stuff's fun. But she was saying as simple as possible. So the bar charts, the scatter plots, and the line charts are mostly what you're going to be doing. I want to go off on a small tangent just for a moment that has nothing to do with small and medium businesses per se, but since I was writing about visualization, I'll come back to the topic of businesses. A few years ago, I went on sabbatical. I have my own company, datalab.cc. I am also a full-time psychology professor. And I went on sabbatical a few years ago with the intention of rounding out my skills to create a curriculum in data visualization at my school. And I looked at what I knew how to do already, some of my design background, and I put together a few different things and said, well, the remaining things that I need to do this well could best be served by going back to school, enrolling as a freshman student again for a year in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Utah. And I did that. It worked out great, but I was in the art department, and one of the things they wanted me to do to get my certificate was to do art projects. I'm not averse to that. What's funny is the program that I had been using to do data visualization, it was the first programming I'd ever really done was processing. Are any of you familiar with processing? Okay, it's a dialect of Java that was specifically developed for artists and designers. There are now versions of it that run in Python and in JavaScript, which is really nice. But it's for making visual art. But it's also a really good tool for data visualization. Before, D3 has sort of taken over that space. But before D3 was around, I think processing was more common. What's funny about it is I learned that I could use processing not just for the data visualization I was trying to learn to do, but I could use it for art. And in fact, it led to my wife and me getting a commission from a modern dance company in Salt Lake City. I had to do a piece. I hooked a Microsoft Connect up to my Mac, ran the data, and recorded dancers doing improvisations, ran the information through through processing, turned it into a live gallery installation piece that was interactive, and some other pieces. And we got this commission with Repertory Dance Theater, and that actually led to me then being paid by my school for 2 years to do interactive video for modern dance instead of really doing statistics. So it was an unusual diversion. There's a reason I mention this, and it's because anytime I'm with a group of people who I know are technically capable, I want to bring this up. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. Modern dance, specifically modern dance, I'm not talking about ballet, I'm not talking about other things. Modern dance has no vocabulary. It is passed entirely through oral tradition. It is not recorded. Yet you can video it. My wife still has a box of like Super 8 tapes and betas of stuff that she did. You can record it that way, but it's not very good. It is something that's passed down almost literally, it has to be passed down from person to person. There is no good method for annotating and recording dance. None, still. Every modern dance choreographer comes up with their own crazy idiosyncratic system that maybe works for them. My wife writes her notes, and a week later, she still doesn't know what they mean. It's crazy. And now, if you're familiar with dance, any of you familiar with Laban notation? No? Okay. It's a method of annotating dance, but you end up with stuff that looks like this, and it takes years to learn how to write it and to learn how to read it. And so Laban notation doesn't count. And the whole issue reminds me, by the way, I'm a big fan of the arts and poetry. There's a little saying that only a poem can translate a poem. And so in terms of visualizing dance, one of my favorite things is if you go to this website, synchronousobjects.osu, ohiostateuniversity.edu, they worked with a choreographer, William Forsythe, not the actor, but the choreographer. And he did a really wonderful piece. This is a whole collection of visualizations that are based off the choreography he did. This is one of them. This is another. This one kind of has nothing to do with it, but it's about choreography, but it's in the same place. They're really neat. They're really wonderful, but what they are is just new works of art based off the other one. There is still nothing for annotating and visualizing dance. I'm throwing this out as a challenge to you guys. If you need something to do for the next 6 years, try to solve that problem. And the art world will thank you. They desperately need it. Okay, right? So this is one that you can't do with the bar charts and the line charts. I'm coming back from my aside. I'm actually going to come back to modern dance in just a moment, believe it or not. The next thing is, once you learn how to adapt some of your methods, you learn how the organization works, you learn what their goals are, and you adapt your methods to their resources and their interests, then you can, it's a wonderful opportunity to connect. And so, for instance, this means actually working with these companies. Now, in terms of working with nonprofit organizations, there's a few ways that you can do that pretty easily. Number one is datakind.org, which, and again, they have been here at this event. Datakind does extraordinary high-end data science for humanitarian purposes. They're based in New York City, but they have chapters all over. There has to be a chapter in Boston. Does anybody know? Are you from Datakind? Okay, but you know there is a chapter here in Boston. Okay. Really extraordinary work. I strongly encourage you to look up Datakind, see if they are doing anything where you work, and see how you can contribute to some of their projects. On a slightly smaller scale, there's Data Analysts for Social Good, another wonderful organization in Chicago, and had an event called Do Good Data, but has transmogrified into the Data World Tour, which means they're actually going to many different cities and trying to find ways to teach people to do data analysis in ways that further social and humanitarian causes. What's nice about this is it's not a full-time job for you. It's an opportunity for you to volunteer some of your time. On a much smaller scale, if you're in Ann Arbor, Michigan, they have the A2 Data Dive. This was my first experience with data dives. I went a few years ago with some of my students. And all it is it's a hackathon. Have any of you been to a data dive before? All right. They're good. They're good. Usually a 2-day event, and you have some nonprofit organizations. They come in, they bring data, and you lock everybody in the room for 2 days, and you see what you can do with the data. Now, it's a really fabulous kind of experience for people in data science because you get to see really what kind of data do they have and what are they looking for. And you also learn how to produce under pressure. You guys know that, for instance, when you're looking for a job in data science, they want to see both that you know how to do the work, they also want to see that you know how to do the work quickly. And this is an opportunity to work under that kind of time pressure. And if you can't get to one of those, you can do it yourself, make your own. I did that 3 years ago. And I now have a twice-a-year event that we are now calling the Data Charrette. Charrette, it's a French term, means small cart, but it's used to refer to creative activity under extreme time pressure. And I stole it from a modern dance event. Anyhow, the Data Charrette, we just had our last one 2 weeks ago, and it was a fabulous event. We pair up with local nonprofit organizations who have data. One group literally brought us pieces of paper that had been written on pencil. This is our data to go with it. Other ones, we had, the most sophisticated we had is they had Salesforce, and they pulled a couple of reports from Salesforce, but they had never analyzed any of it. And so it was a matter of putting the data into spreadsheets and then trying to answer some basic questions, like, for instance, who are our major donors and how do we contact them? And are they involved with people who have been through our programs at all? One of our recent organizations was a group called SpyHop that does media training for youth, 10 to 20 years old. So they do music and video game programming. And the beautiful thing about analysis in any situation is you find things that you did not expect. We found that their major donors were not the people who had been most connected with the program. In fact, they were generally people whose kids had been to a week-long program one of the summers. It was just enough to establish contact and goodwill for the organization, but to let them know that they can focus things a little bit differently. The other organization we worked with most recently was the Utah Pride Center, a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender organization in Salt Lake City, which had a gargantuan amount, gargantuan means a different thing to you guys. I'm from the social sciences, 200 cases is gargantuan. And this one was several thousand cases. It was huge. But it was survey data from teenagers who had attended their annual queer prom event. And they were able to, which actually was happening the same night that we were doing the charrette. Anyhow, a really wonderful opportunity to get in and mix it up with the data and see what works there. I can make a few suggestions if you want to do something like this. If you want to organize your own event, it's really easy to find people to work with, but make sure that they have a clear question that they want answered. Like a couple of years ago, we worked with the Springfield Museum of Art. They just said, should we still be open on Sundays? Not a lot of people come. Is it worth it? And we were able to give them an answer at the end of it. We said, no, because the only people who ever show up on Sundays only show up once a month for your evening concerts. You don't need to have the building open, which is good because they don't have any money to staff the building. Also, prepare analysis templates. Maybe you guys have that sort of stuff together, but you know, for instance, I work in R, and it's really good if you have a whole thing already together that will load up the packages that's already set up to start doing data cleaning. Because you guys know the rule of thumb, 80% of the time on a project is spent cleaning data. That's true on these 2-day events. We're usually cleaning data until 12 or 2 o'clock of the second day. We're trying to find some way to deal with that, which in fact leads to this one. If there's any way possible, try to do some sort of data preparation ahead of time. And then a really interesting one is, following up. That means not just following up with the organizations to see if what you did makes sense to them, but as one person suggested at this last event, and I feel silly for not doing this sooner, the organization's going to do something with the analysis that you did. They're going to usually turn it into part of a presentation they give to shareholders or to the outreach groups. They can invite you to those events. You can actually see the fruits of your labors being implemented and making a benefit. And again, with these organizations, the one that we did in the fall, we did it with this microscopic nonprofit. They got a $3,000 donation they had not been planning on. They were practically apoplectic as a result of it. That was like a 10% increase in their budget. So very small things can make a difference. Let me suggest this. If any of this sounds interesting to you, adopt an organization, specifically a nonprofit. I have done that. My company has adopted the Rose Wagner Performing Arts Center in Salt Lake City. It actually has 6 companies within it, 3 dance companies, 2 theater companies, and 1 music organization. And we are going to be working with them for the next year to try to get functional data strategies for every one of these companies. Some of them are slightly big, meaning they have, if you don't count the performers, the office staff, they have like 8 people on the office staff. Some of them have like 1.5 people full-time. But they all need the benefits of data science. That's my point here. They all, you guys understand, okay, backing up. You remember the Netflix prize from like, what, 5-10 years ago? Where Netflix was saying, we're going to give $1 million to anybody who can improve the efficiency of our recommendation algorithm by 10%. And that's, you got some really extraordinary work that went into that. And then, of course, the moral of the story is they didn't use the algorithm. But anyhow. But the point of that one is, 10%, that's actually that's a big boost for a company like Netflix. I know that very often when you're working at enterprise level, even 0.1% can work out to a huge improvement for an enterprise's bottom end. Well, when you have 2 people working in a 40 square foot office and they have an operating budget of $60,000 a year, even that kind of thing can make a big difference for them, like whether they get to buy lunch the next week. And so you have an opportunity to make a real impact and then to be connected with these people and see how what you were able to do works out for them. If you're looking for organizations in your area, so for instance, in Utah, we have Utah Nonprofits Association. Call them up. They'll give you a lot of people who are interested. I'm sure there are similar organizations in every other state or city. Also, back to the business world, connect with a small business development center. Have any of you ever put your foot inside an SBDC before? Okay, they exist. They tend to be small little things, and they tend to be on small college campuses. So for instance, this is the one that's at my university, Utah Valley University. It's across the street in a former car dealership. But that's the Small Business Development Center in Orem, Utah. And there's a few reasons that these are, and what I'm saying is you go there and you tell them, I am able to volunteer 2 or 3 days to help organizations learn to put together a data strategy or to answer some data questions. They will be eternally grateful, and you will get a few things out of it. Number one, you will get very good practice in working with data, especially different kinds of data and different questions. This is the sort of thing, you know, when I teach students in universities, they always go, when am I going to use this stuff? You're going to use it right here, and you're going to learn how to do things that you didn't expect. Number two, it's really good networking. Because not only do you get to work with these companies, you also get to work with the Small Business Development Center, which is almost always funded by a very large business in the area. That one was funded by Vivint, who does home automation. They're gargantuan in Utah now. The one that's further north is run by the Larry Miller Company, which made billions of dollars, you know, in cars. It is a really wonderful networking opportunity. And then finally, this is one that I've wondered about, haven't pursued it, but if you actually work for a large organization, they often need to do a fair amount of charitable giving during the year. It's part of the strategy. You could do in-kind sort of pro bono work where you or your team at your enterprise spend a day or two working with small businesses or with nonprofits as a way of providing your charitable giving. It's a wonderful opportunity, and there is already an incentive for your organization to do it. Besides, I'd like to say it's a paid day, not at work. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention is enable. You know the story about, you know, give a person a fish they eat for a day, that teach them to fish, then they drink all your beer and tell lies all day. But anyhow, teach them to fish. Make it so they can do this stuff on their own. That's important. You cannot teach them how to do, you know, fire up the Amazon web servers. You're not going to do that stuff with them. But you can teach them how to do the Excel functions. You can teach them how to find open data that is relevant to what they do and bring it in. You can teach them how to make the bar charts and the line graphs and how to interpret these things. You need to be able to hand it off. And to do that, after you've worked with them, number one, just in case nobody's told you before, document your work, okay? And this includes explaining every single thing you did. Explain your decisions. Say why you're bringing it in, what it's going to do. If you are in a situation where you do have to write code, you're going to want to have like the most heavily commented code you've ever written in your life. This is what it does, because it will not be you who's doing it next time. It'll be somebody else. Plan for common tools. And that also means plan for tools that don't cost money. So Excel is very common. It does cost money. If the stuff that you're going to do can be done in Google Sheets, even better. R is fine. Python is fine. SAS creates a problem, because you know, they can't afford SAS and they don't have anybody who can run it anyhow. I know there's the university edition. I know about that. That's a different thing. Save your work in generic formats. Save it as text files. Save it as CSV files. We've had problems with this before. Have you ever been given a file that you couldn't open? OK. Save in generic formats. Text documents, CSV files, and that's pretty much it. And then save in an accessible location, like not on your computer that you then take away, but on something that they will have access to permanently. Now, I will mention that depending on the data and the organization you're working with, this can bring up issues of data governance. That's a separate, but it's a very important but a separate consideration. I'm not going to get into data governance. But depending on the data, you may have to address those issues with them and school them a little bit on how to keep their data secure. But most of the time, the stuff that you have is nowhere close to sensitive. The general idea here is that you want to support self-sufficiency. You can help them set it up. You can tell them what they need to do. You can demonstrate it. You can do the analysis once, but you do want to be able to hand it off. It's good to stay in contact with them. One of the things I do is I have my own company. I make videos that teach people how to do things. And so for these organizations, I create materials. They say, this is how, in case you forgot what I did, go back here, you'll see the video and you'll figure it out. This one it actually does link to a whole bunch of videos. They're constantly under development. So there's a bunch of stuff there on data science and R and SPSS at the moment. But there's more coming. And anyhow, that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much. So I'm just wondering very quickly, have any of you had experience volunteering as an analyst with any companies or nonprofits or people around? Who have you worked with?
Turns out it's many years ago now, but it was a charity bike ride going from Boston to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, there was a nonprofit office in Boston, I think two in New York, that were benefiting from them. And they were using an Access database. And I went in and they had separate queries for every member of the office. And it had never occurred to them that that was something that was parameterizable, right? And so anytime anybody would make a switch to one of them, they then had to rewrite and copy and do all this stuff. And I spent a day with them just taking a look at their stuff, and probably the biggest takeaway that they had from what I did was I took the best copy of the report they had and put in a parameter in place of the hard-coded employee name. And now they had one copy of the report. They're like, and I made the parameter pop up if anybody's ever used Access. If you've got a parameterized report, it pops up an input box for you to type in the parameter value. And so I just called the parameter employee with a question mark. And so it would pop up. I was essentially asking them the question, and they typed it in and they got the report. And they thought that was the greatest thing they'd ever seen in their life.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. Anybody else? Yeah, what have you?
Mine built a database system for an animal shelter. You get to call maybe a couple times.
That's a wonderful thing. Anybody else? Yeah? That's fabulous. How about you?
I was going to say in Salt Lake City, I am working with a really new nonprofit that teaches refugees coming from the IRC coding. So we teach the kids game design, AR, VR, and we teach adults.
This is in Salt Lake?
Yeah.
What's the organization?
It's called VR Makers SLC. I'm going to talk to you about it.
Wonderful.
What I'm trying to do is I'm helping with the design of digitizing the onboarding system so that you can collect data and then use it. But like travelers aware of the program, and the state gives them money, and Goldman Sachs and Adobe and
The building is apparently on fire now.
emergency flash flood alert.
Flash flood coming straight down the street here. In southern Utah, that actually means something significant. Who else? I saw some. Tell me some of the stuff you've done. Yeah.
I made a photo lookup app, which we used when we were collecting signatures to get voting on the ballot. So check the photo.
And sometimes these seem like really small things, but they make such big differences. And sometimes I say, you look at the stuff and you're like, well, this is easy. Everybody knows how to do this. Well, everybody who actually has your experience knows how to do this, but they don't. And I think, anyhow, try it out. Yeah.
I have a contrary experience. I helped out as like an advisor to a student World Health Hackathon, and they had no idea who's going to use their stuff or what to do, and they just wanted to.
Yeah, okay, so there is the issue of both poor organization and learned helplessness and things going awry. That gets back to the organizational skills that need to go into the event in the first place. And it's also where we're very clear to them, we're doing this for you once. But we'll keep in touch. We'll see how it goes. But I also say you have to have clear questions and you got to show me your data beforehand. And so we do a little bit of damage control ahead of time. Yeah.
Question for everyone. How do you approach them? How do you tell them that you don't have any nefarious intent?
I'm sorry, how do you tell them?
How do you tell them that you don't have any nefarious intent? I mean, you're not going to do anything bad.
Do you know what? Most of the time, they're so grateful that somebody actually called them. They kind of like sit around in their office going like this, do, 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 do. They're so happy that somebody. I've only had that come up to the tiniest bit once. And all we had to do is like, oh, we'll have people sign their names. We'll have their names and their emails, and we'll tell them, you can't download this and take it. That was it. Everybody was happy. You do have to make it very clear, though, that you're not recruiting. Because I know hackathons in general are thinly veiled recruiting. This is specifically a service thing I'm talking about.
Yeah,
But
I'm not talking about a hackathon. I'm just saying just go to a local theater and ask them if you have any data.
do you know what? That's where hooking up with the Small Business Development Center or the nonprofit association make a big difference, because then they're the intermediary. And it's easy to build a relationship with them, and then they can simply reach out to the organizations that they work with. Yeah.
So what are the drawbacks to using open office spreadsheets to look at Excel?
There are certain plugins to email. I mentioned the social media marketing and the email marketing. Some of them have integrations that work just with Excel. And so it comes down to, when you find the organization, you got to find out what software they're using. And OpenOffice may work in that situation. But the integrations that they use for marketing can complicate things. And you had something.
Yeah, two thoughts. One was that when you go to, if it's a nonprofit that you're going to help, keep in mind that most people that work at nonprofits are themselves not nefarious. And most people project. Doesn't matter what you're talking about, most people project. If they're nice people, it would never occur to them that you would do anything bad with their data. In fact, they don't know how to do anything bad with the data. They don't think anything bad can be done with it. So they're just going to be so grateful that anybody's going to help them at all. So be nice when you go. The other thing was on your slide where you were talking about sort of the wrap up of how
Yep,
to do
yep.
everything. The one thing I would add to yours, I thought was a great
Yeah.
list, was make sure that they understand the life cycle, the utility of the answer you've given them. Because if they haven't fully grasped that you talked to the fish, they also need to know that they need to go fishing again. Right? So if you give them an answer, realize, just let them know what the lifespan of that answer is.
That's right. Data has a shelf life,
Right.
and the recommendations have a shelf life. Yeah. Well, folks, our time is up, and I think this means the conference is like totally over, and you get to go home now. Hopefully, you did not win the tickets to the Sox game, because that ain't happening tonight. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.